All right, my awesome students, and good to see you again. In this video, we're going to talk about the politics of ancient Egypt, and we're going to focus on the leaders, the pharaohs, and kind of why they were a big deal, and some of the important pharaohs and some of their accomplishments. So let's just dive right in. Now, ancient Egyptian civilization lasted a very long time. Civilization in ancient Egypt lasted almost 2,000 years. Now remember, people were there before, they were hunter-gatherers, and civilization started slowly. But when the first kingdoms and the first cities and empires and things started to be created in ancient Egypt, it was on and off for about 2,000 years. It could go on even further, but the main ones that we're talking about lasted during this time period. During this time period, ancient Egyptian civilization was broken down into three kingdoms. And inside these kingdoms, there were many, many different leaders and many different events and many different things that they were known for. But the three were the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdoms. Pretty easy to remember. The reasons why there are these gaps that you can see right here, there's a gap right here, there's a gap right here in between the years, is because, in between the Old and the Middle Kingdoms, towards the end of the Old Kingdom, right around here, the nobility, so the people who were not pharaohs, not leaders, but had a whole lot of power, they started to kind of take too much power, and eventually the pharaoh lost all of their control over the civilization of ancient Egypt, and so the Old Kingdom kind of fell. And so during this time period here, the nobility ruled ancient Egypt, and it was very kind of separated. The different parts of Egypt were very separated, and there wasn't one big country of Egypt. But that stopped in the year 2000. In the year 2050 BCE, and the Middle Kingdom began, and that lasted for about 300 years until, in 1750, a tribe called the Hyksos came in and conquered Egypt. Took out the pharaoh, and they ruled for about 200 years. The Hyksos are, you're going to hear them a lot in ancient civilization talk as you learn more. But the Hyksos were kind of funny. When they took over ancient Egypt, they didn't eliminate Egyptian culture. They kind of adopted some of it, and so that's why we were able to keep some of the ancient Egyptian knowledge that we know. Now, in 1550, a man by the name of Amos reunited Egypt, kicked the Hyksos out, and started the new kingdom here. And that lasted until about 1050. And this was the very height during these three kingdoms. This was the very height, the very peak, or the top of ancient Egyptian civilization. So let's talk about pharaohs. The pharaohs. The pharaohs were the head of a type of government called a monarchy. A monarchy, maybe you've heard of before. It's kings and queens, and basically a pharaoh is a king. The pharaoh, most of the time, would get its power from dad. Dad either dies, or dad would say to the son, "You will be the next pharaoh, the next king, the next leader of ancient Egypt." And so the pharaohs were all part of the same family, and they believed that the family line was very important. So sometimes pharaohs would marry their cousins, or daughters even sometimes, just to make sure that the family line kept power, and the family line was very strong. And when when you keep power inside the family and you pass it on from generation to generation, so from father to son, son to grandson, and so on, that is a monarchy, and it's also a form of hereditary lines. So pharaohs were the supreme leaders, but Any leader cannot run a country by themselves. They need help. They need help. And the main chief advisor, the main helper to the Pharaoh was the vizier. Vizier. That's this guy here. Vizier. And he was the chief helper. If you wanted to talk to the Pharaoh, you'd have to talk to him first. And he would help the Pharaoh run the whole country. Now, pharaohs were seen by everyone in the country as a god on earth, a physical person who is also a god. And when the pharaoh dies, they go through the afterlife process that we may have talked about with the judgment of the dead, and they finally become part of the god Osiris, who's the god of the underworld. The pharaoh's duty is to, yes, run the country, control the country, have taxes, fight wars if it needs to. But another one of their duties is to build the temples and support the Egyptian religion. And so the pharaohs and the politics of ancient Egypt, they're very closely linked together with the religion. Religion and politics are linked. Okay, they're very, very close together. And so the Pharaoh felt that they were part God, they were worshipped as part God. If the rains came and it was a good harvest, the Pharaohs were celebrated. If it was like a drought and people were suffering, the Pharaohs were cursed by the people. So the Pharaohs and religion are very, very similar, are very linked because of their ancient Egyptian religion. A fun fact: some pharaohs wore a crown that had a cobra goddess on it. You can see that cobra goddess up here on this. Okay? And they thought only the pharaohs could wear this cobra goddess, and they thought the cobra goddess would protect the pharaoh by spitting flames at enemies. Just another symbol of the pharaohs linked together with Egyptian religion and all of their kind of magic and superstitions that they believed in. But now let's talk about some pretty important pharaohs in ancient Egyptian history. So, famous pharaohs. We've probably all heard of the pyramids of Egypt. Okay, and here are the three big ones and some of the smaller ones. Here are some of the smaller ones and the big ones. At Giza, okay, and this is, Giza, the pyramids of Giza, and the big one, this big one here, was made by Khufu. We don't know a whole lot about Khufu, but we do know that that's his pyramid, and these pyramids were where the pharaohs were buried. There was a bunch of treasures and things to help them in the afterlife. It was like their big tomb, their big burial site. And it was a symbol, again, to link the pharaoh with ancient Egyptian religion. Another pretty important pharaoh was Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut is interesting because he was actually a she. She was the mother to the new pharaoh. Okay, so her husband died, and the new pharaoh, the baby, was a baby, so not ready to lead. So Hatshepsut took over the country until the new pharaoh was ready and old enough to lead. And Hatshepsut, because many people back then and even today in some countries don't really feel like women should be leaders. Hatshepsut decided to dress like a man, act like a man. She even called herself a man. That's why you'll see she wore this awesome little beard, and she dressed like a man, and to kind of help support her job as pharaoh. During her reign, she was very successful. She helped countries trade with, or helped Egypt trade with other countries, and made Egypt a very successful country. But when she died, the new pharaoh actually destroyed a lot of the monuments and stuff that she created, just because it was a she. Just because Hatshepsut was a she. Another pharaoh is Ramses II, and they call him Ramses the Great. Okay, he was a great military leader. He won many battles. That's why you see him here on this chariot. But he also built some very, very important temples and shrines, and he was one of the most successful leaders. After Ramses the Great, Egypt really never was as strong as it ever was. Ramses the Great made Egypt like its very, very top, its very peak of power and wealth. But after him, the pharaohs just couldn't keep the control and keep the power that Ramses the Great had built. You know. And so finally, we get to Tutankhamun. King Tutankhamun. We all know about King Tut, don't we? We've heard about him. King Tut. Okay? And King Tut really in the history of pharaohs, he didn't really do a whole lot. He died young. He wasn't pharaoh for very long. But what's important about King Tut is that his tomb, the one that he was buried in, really small one compared to other pharaohs. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings, where a lot of other pharaohs were buried. Valley of the Kings. His tomb was not robbed. All of the stuff that he was buried with was still there in 1920 when we found all of his stuff, when we found his tomb. And so you see his burial mask right here. Burial mask. And like I said before, King Tut is very famous and very unique because we know how he was buried, and it gives us clues as to some of the wealth and the things that pharaohs and important people in ancient Egypt, the things that they were buried with and their beliefs, and some of the things they thought that they were going to need in the afterlife. And like you can see here, even his burial mask, the thing that went over his mummy, it's like solid gold. So even a weak king, a king who wasn't, or a pharaoh that wasn't there for very long, even a small pharaoh would be buried with enormous wealth, lots and lots of money, and things that were valuable. So that is why King Tut is very famous. Now there are many, many other famous pharaohs, from Cleopatra to Ahmose to Nefertiti, another woman leader. And these pharaohs you can research on your own. But here's a brief summary. So thank you for watching, guys.